Welcome everybody. I'm Ned Allen, Director of the Bridgton Historical Society. If you don't know me, we're really thrilled to have you here, and we're really excited to have Chris Kloss from Maine Preservation, who is going to be helping us with a really important survey of the town. He's also been consulting with us on the restoration work we've been doing at Narromissik, and he and his organization are just a tremendous resource, and we're lucky to have them. And I won't waste any more time and just turn it right over to him.
Okay, thanks, Ned.
Yep.
Thank you. I'm overwhelmed. I didn't think we'd get 35 people, but that's about how many are here, so great. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you this evening on behalf of the Historical Society here in Bridgton. We've had a long relationship with Ned and the organization, at least in the 9 years I've been in Maine working with Maine Preservation. The title of the show tonight, as you can see, is at the top, Preserving Rural Character, Community Character, and the Role of the Architectural Survey. The project that Ned mentioned, for which they have a sizable grant for, is the Architectural Survey of the town of Bridgton. And I wanted to kick off the project publicly, or help Ned do that this evening, by giving an introductory slideshow. There will be several more of these for the volunteers, but we'll go into greater depth on the actual architectural style of each of the types of properties that are represented here in Bridgton and that the volunteers will be seeing when they go out in the field with their cameras. But I wanted to tie the idea of the survey and its role into community planning. So that's what I'm going to address for the first few minutes. And then we will talk about what you may expect to find out in the field. Next. I knew it would work. But first, of course, the outline of this evening, we'll talk about the survey, we'll talk about the Architectural Resources Survey form, there's a picture of that, and then we'll go into the types of styles that you would be likely to encounter. Next, please. Of course, we have to have a commercial first, so. Our organization is approaching its 50th anniversary in several years. We're a membership organization that was formed in the Portland area in 1972. We have about 1,500 members statewide currently. I won't read our mission, but you can see what we do. Next. Thanks. I actually one back.
Gotta figure that out.
My job at Maine Preservation is to manage the Field Services program, which is one of the 5 that I'll speak of here this evening. I circuit ride the entire state of Maine, providing information to municipalities, developers, private homeowners, nonprofit organizations, just about anyone who has an interest in historic preservation and the use of that tool in downtown revitalization or preserving community character in the more rural communities. We have another program called Protect and Sell, formerly called the Revolving Fund, where we actually acquire options on properties, take over the responsibility for marketing them, create a preservation easement, and then at the sale of the property, we record the preservation easement so that that property can be preserved in perpetuity. We don't actually own any of these buildings, or at least for very long. With an option, we own the building for about 5 minutes. We've done half a dozen of these in the last several years, and it's a program that's growing to the point where we now have a full-time real estate manager at the office in Yarmouth. Preservation easements, that program goes back now probably 15 or 20 years. We have 10 easements on properties around the state. The largest one probably you're all familiar with is just down the road here at the Shaker Village in New Gloucester. We have an easement on 17 of the buildings there. That is a popular program. There are, for those of you who may be involved in estate planning, I'll just say that there are some tax incentives involved. So if you're involved in estate planning work, this may be a way to not only preserve the family property, but to also shed value at a time when you need to do that. Every year in the summertime, we announce our most endangered places list, and that usually consists of anywhere from 10 to 15 properties around the state. They're not necessarily always buildings. We've included bridges as well, landscapes, other threatened aspects of the built environment. One year I think we included historic wooden windows on the list. This last year was quite interesting because two of them involved MDOT, and one's a bridge and the other is downtown Wiscasset. So we're not afraid to lock horns when we need to. And finally, in order to train the preservation planners of the future, we have a summer fellow program, and usually take on 4 graduate students that work with us for a 10-week period during the summer. Half of that time in the trades with a general contractor involved in preservation, and the other half of the time at the office, helping us prepare the most endangered places and the honor awards program, which I didn't put on here because I ran out of room, but that's held in November. Last thing I'll say is our annual meeting and Old House Forum is held every May. This year it's going to be in Camden. You're all welcome to come. If you're not a member, there's a small fee, but we have a good day we put on with 3 or 4 speakers about technical issues associated with the field, and then have our very brief annual meeting and a luncheon. It's usually a good event. Typically we attract about 100 people. So you're all welcome if you'd like to do that, or call the office for more information. Okay, Ned. Now, I mentioned earlier that we would talk about the composition of an architectural survey and what it does. Next slide, please. First, I wanted to say that it's directly linked to the process of comprehensive planning. The state of Maine in 1943, for the first time, required that any community that wanted to enact ordinances at the local level would need to engage in a comprehensive planning process and come up with a document that represented a roadmap to the future for that community. And that still applies today. I know that Bridgton does not have zoning, nor does it have any protections for historic properties in the form of a historic preservation ordinance or a landmarks ordinance, or a demolition delay, or probably half a dozen other types of legal tools that I could mention to you that are used in other communities pretty effectively, I will say. Norway probably is one that I would mention to you that a couple of years ago we helped them enact a demolition delay ordinance, and I think that's worked pretty well up to date. The idea of preserving rural character is a slippery thing. I've been in the planning business for most of my adult career, and it's a hard thing to do. But one of the very first steps that you have to engage in is to identify what it is that constitutes the rural character of the community that you're trying to preserve. That is the place that you call home, or where you work, or where your family has lived for 200 years, or where the family farm is. Without codifying those things in some sort of a survey or document that enumerates what they are and where they are on a map, you really don't have much of a base to start with. So that's part of what the architectural survey does. We look at the buildings, or what I'll call the built environment. It's not always buildings. It can be stone walls, it can be barns, it can be other types of structures, bridges, lots of different things. We look at those things and try to canvass the local community and look at anything that is older than 50 years old. And the reason we pick that date, and I'm not sure yet that's been settled here in this survey, but I'll just say to you that the 50-year look-back period actually comes from the National Register for Historic Places. That's one of the criteria that they use to consider a building eligible for the National Register. Now that's a rolling deadline. So everything before 1968 at this moment could possibly be listed in the National Register if it met the other criteria. But it's looking at the age of all of us here tonight, it's hard to believe that anything from 1968 is already considered historic, but that's our luck in life. Anyway, that's how we go about looking at this, and that rolls forward every year with each passing year. I've mentioned that there are several different types of ordinances that can be used to protect historic resources, regulations, other types of planning tools. There are also economic incentives. I'll get to those in a few minutes when we talk about what the financial incentives are for preservation that we have both here in Maine and is offered by the federal government. And then finally, there are private sector legal instruments like preservation easements that I mentioned earlier, or other types of instruments that will protect a building for a limited period of time or sometimes in perpetuity. Next, please. Why is the architectural survey important? What does it do? So in addition to identifying where these resources are, what they are, and putting them on a map, we also look eventually at the other end of the survey, not the front end. We also look at their level of significance, either at the local, state, or national level. Again, those levels of significance flow from the National Register of Historic Places, which is a program has been managed by the National Park Service since 1966 when it was created. Most states, most local governments now that have historic commissions use those standards. The information that's going to be created here in Bridgton will eventually go into the comprehensive plan in the appendices, and it will remain there permanently. Some communities don't necessarily use the 50-year look-back period. Yarmouth is currently looking at a 75-year period. They previously did a survey back in the 1970s, and they're now updating that work. So it's a dynamic document in that it lives on because of its attachment to the comprehensive plan. Its main use is helping, and I'll call them the planners, even though most of us are citizen planners, volunteer planners. It helps improve the quality of future land use decisions, because when you look at a map and see where these resources are, and particularly when you see clusters of them, and I know in Bridgton you have at least 4 discernible villages, you'll actually see what looks like districts of buildings. And that's a pattern that will emerge as we do the survey. So the ability to discern what the impact of a land use decision may be is better understood when you have this information in front of you and you can say, well, do we want to allow a, I don't know, I'm not picking on McDonald's tonight, but since I just ate there. But in the middle of a pristine historic district, do we want a McDonald's or something like that, or a Family Dollar store, or a slaughterhouse, or whatever? So yeah, I think you get the idea. Additionally, the survey will help foster a pride of place through civic involvement and a better understanding of what your own legacy is and what the patrimony of the town is in terms of its historical meaning. I think lastly, the statement about anchoring the community in the knowledge of its future development, its past and future development. I've been involved in planning for many years, and one of the things that I've picked up over those years is that to have a perspective that looks both to the rear and forward, I think helps balance and make a more informed decision. Next, please. Now, we get down to the aspects that have some meaning, some additional meaning in the economic value of the survey. Usually when the survey is finished and promoted and there are more public meetings like this and a good slideshow that shows you some of the great buildings that are in this town. I've actually been working in Bridgton since the mid-1990s, not in my current position, but as a consultant, so I know the town somewhat. And you've got some great buildings here that represent a long and wide range of architectural style in the history of the nation's architecture. But the identification, once this information becomes known, I think stimulates people, because these buildings aren't going to be reproduced again. These styles are gone. They're not being reproduced now, or at least not very well. And they represent different meaning in terms of the political history, the design history of our towns and cities. And by the influence from overseas, up until the 1870s, we imported every architectural style that you'll see in this country. So after that, we began to understand that we could have our own style. The identification of landmarks, the erection of markers, historic markers, the creation or recognition of scenic roads with historic architecture along those roads, or a downtown, all these things enhance tourism. And I think you all know the importance to our economy in Maine of tourism. People come here to look at us and see what we look like and where we live and where we work. And we've got some great buildings to be able to tell that story. National Register designation, which is something that can follow later for some of the properties that will be identified if people are interested. You can either individually identify a building, get it on the listed on the National Register, or create a historic district. National Register does not protect buildings. It only offers limited protection from federally funded projects. It has no impact on local property ownership or individual property ownership, or at the local level. So it's not a form of zoning. It's an honorary designation that protects you from federally funded projects. But it does also have lucrative tax credit incentives, which were created in 1976. The federal tax credit is 20% for rehabilitating a building that's on the National Register. And since 2008, when Maine overhauled its state tax credit, we have a 25% tax credit in the state of Maine, which you can use against your Maine state tax liability. Those can be combined. So imagine buying a historic income-producing building and getting 45% of your investment back. I'm not kidding about this. 45% of your investment back, because you can combine the two programs. I won't dwell on this too long, but that's the greatest lollipop we have in the field of historic preservation today, and have had for a couple of decades. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of scale, since 2008, and remember what happened in 2007 in this country, since 2008 there have been over 95 National Register income-producing buildings rehabilitated in the state of Maine, with an investment that represents nearly $500 million. Not million, $500 million. So I can give you the rest of the statistics if you wanted, but not tonight, about the thousands of units of affordable housing that have also been created, the several thousand jobs, both in construction and permanent jobs as well. So we have a nice little industry going here in Maine with our historic building rehabilitation work. Identifying some of the buildings that can be income producing may bring to owners, maybe some of you in this room, the possibility of some financial help with some of these buildings. And then finally, I mentioned the number of affordable housing units. That's particularly important because Maine's economy is suffering because we don't have places where people can live affordably close to where they work. Gee, I'm sounding like Governor LePage here for a minute, but that is true, and we need to create more affordable housing so that we can support our economy and allow people to not have to commute every day, but live closer to where they work. Next, please. Okay, finally, let me just say that by deepening the community's understanding of itself, it generally turns out, for those who want to take the trouble to read the survey and understand the history of these buildings, there's usually a deeper sense of community responsibility, both at the planning board level and I think among individuals. You have a pattern now, which goes way back to the 18th century, of 4 major villages and then a rural landscape around it, which is still largely agricultural or forested. have to throw in the resort industry also that made its appearance in the 19th century. But it makes it a very unique place. Bridgton, because of its water resources, its water power, the 3 woolen mills that existed here, the presence of the railroad up until the 1940s. It's a pretty unique place. It's also a beautiful place to live. So the architecture contributes to the natural environment and complements it. Let me combine the last two. The tax base of Maine's communities is extremely important to the quality of the environment that we want to have and continue to have in our homes in Maine. I'm sure you all know of historic buildings that have not been maintained or couldn't be maintained because there wasn't the money in the family to do it. Stimulating preservation of these buildings ultimately is going to feed the tax base. It's going to strengthen and fortify our local tax base. And that's the bottom line in terms of our maintaining our communities and our school systems and jobs. Ned, if you could move me on to the next one. So, enough sermonizing on the value of the survey. These things have been, surveys have been in operation in practical practice since the 1930s, beginning in Savannah and Charleston. That's really where a survey got its start. I'm going to show you what the survey form looks like in a minute. It's a 2-sided form that's provided by the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. They've used it forever. It's periodically updated. Contains a lot of interesting information about the building. And to give you an idea what the rest of the project looks like, there will be a period now which Ned is working out over a period of several months this spring where we'll train the volunteers that are going to do this. The field photography and the filling out of the forms in the field is the field component. Excuse me. And then finally, if there's time and the spirit and willingness to do it, the state of Maine, meaning the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and MDOT, share something called the CARMA database, which is a computerized database which stands for Cultural and Architectural Resources. I knew this would happen. You've got the idea. I should know that by heart, but I sometimes forget the last 2 letters of it. Anyway, these survey forms are downloaded into a statewide database so that at the state level, eventually, 100 years from now, I don't know when, we'll have a pretty good idea of what's out there in terms of Maine's historic architecture in many of the communities. It's I've forgotten how many thousand entries are in it now, but it's something that we can do here if there's the time and the willingness to do it. Next, please. So here's what the survey form looks like. I don't know whether anybody here can read that, but it's a little blurry to me. Ned, is that, can we improve the, okay. Let me just say that there's property location and contact information. You've got a couple of... Oh. He's good. I want to use him again. Can you all see what we've got here now? So when we get through the contact information and what the current use of the property is, we get into the architectural data. And there's probably 20 different styles listed here. So usually one or more of those is checked off. If it's a mixture of styles, you get a second chance and you can put a secondary category in there. If it's a very old building that's been remodeled, that's where we would use these two. We look at the height, number of stories, talk about the primary facade, how many bays, doors, windows, and then finally what the appendages are: rear L, wing, porch, tower, added stories, cupola, bay window. I can't read some of the others. Dormers. And then the back is more of the same, but in a little more detail. And then there is a section on the back also where you can fill in the historic information. Date it was constructed, if there was a local contractor or even an architect involved, there's a place for that. And then there's a couple of lines just to give what the surveyor may know about the significance of the building. So these can be filled out usually in 5, 7, 8 minutes. I don't know, it depends how good you get at it. But one of the things that the training covers is helping the volunteers understand how to identify the architectural style. That's quite important. We can move on. So that's what we're going to move into next. Any questions at the moment? I don't want to be the one talking all night and not allowing any
This
questions.
might sound silly, but are you just doing it from street view to the front? Are you doing, I mean, I could be counting windows till next week.
Yeah, we won't be calling people ahead of time to clean up their yard. No, the volunteers will not enter onto private property. That's sort of a standard rule of the game. And any photograph will be taken from the street. Yes, sir.
With Google Maps as it is, you can see that right on your computer.
On rainy and snowy days, that's not a bad idea. The problem is that some of the pictures on Google Earth go back as far as 2011. So we're looking for something current.
Okay.
But good point. And let me just add to that though. For a property that has a long driveway and can't be seen from the street, that may be a resource or not. Usually Google, I don't think Google goes onto private property either when they photograph these streetscapes.
But I think
But
there's drones.
you can see the roof planes and you can see if there's a barn attached or if it's connected architecture, that sort of thing. So it could be of some help. So that's a good point.
What
Yes.
about something instead of building, for instance, a private property root cellar? Obviously, you're not supposed to go on to the property, but you can see its existence from the road. And there's one I love in your zone. So can you ask permission of the homeowner to get a picture closer up?
Good question. We normally get a letter from the Board of Selectmen or the Planning Board, or co-signed by both, introducing the project in the form of a letter to the homeowner, and each volunteer will carry one of those letters with them in case the shepherd comes out after them or there's an altercation at the mailbox or whatever.
Yep.
So that's a partial answer to that question. If the volunteers know of a resource that can't be seen from the road that is important like that, I mean, an actual dedicated root cell in a farm complex would be pretty important. So I would, unless, Ned, you can think of any reason not to, if the, I don't know whether it should be the volunteer or whether it should be Ned calling ahead first. I suspect that I'll be right with you. I suspect that the better way to do this might be, if you know of such a thing, talk with Ned, and then we call the owner first, rather than just show up when they're
Right.
in the shower or having breakfast. Go ahead.
Yeah, just curious, and my comment/question ties in both with previous. Remote sensing is what we're talking about.
Mhm.
So there's a layer called LiDAR, that when you look at this layer, you can see these things through the trees. It's done from above with lasers, and you can see these, like, as if you strip all the vegetation off the plant. You can see all the old stone walls and cellar holes, and I was wondering if that could possibly be, or if it is a component of this.
Could you spell that?
LiDAR is an acronym, LIDAR, for
LIDAR.
laser something something something.
That's how they discovered all more ruins.
Yeah, cover
in
me.
Mexico.
Egyptian
Exactly.
tombs and all
Yeah,
that?
we have
Okay.
that for this. That coverage exists for this area.
It does.
Yeah.
How do we, can we
I
access
did not know about that.
Yep. For free.
Oh, we want that.
That's our price range.
So is that, how would you access that?
It's multiple ways, but someone mentioned Google Earth. Google Earth has become very savvy of late, and they can look at various products where just 5 years ago it couldn't. There's a thing called Maine GIS.
Yeah,
It's where the state stores all its GIS layers, geographic information.
familiar with that.
systems. And one of those layers in there is this new LiDAR coverage. And you can
Really?
actually pull that right into Google Earth and look at it.
I'm going to actually send a memo tomorrow to the Maine Historic Preservation Commission and see if they know about it, and if they don't, that's great to know, because when you have to review a project that's using state or federal funds and it's north of Millinocket, this could be pretty handy. So great, excellent comment. Yeah.
One
the comprehensive plans have to be redone every 10 years.
Yep.
Does the survey have to be redone every 10 years, or can you take a survey from the previous one and put it onto the next one? You know, how long is the usefulness of this
Yeah, that's a
information?
good point. And I just today looked up your comprehensive plan and see that it went through the review and was approved in, I wrote it down here, 2015. November 16th of 2015, the review was considered complete and consistent and was approved at that point. I don't know of any community that does an entire architectural survey again over every 10 years. I mentioned Yarmouth. There are a couple of other communities I've run into where they did their first surveys in the 70s or the early 80s, and they're starting to do them over again now. So that's a 30-year period. And I would think that would be more than adequate. Every 10 years would be an exception, but nice thought. Good job creation. But we're not picking up that many new homes probably in a 10-year period to warrant doing something of this magnitude every 10 years. So I would say, now the exception to that would be if you decide to only look at properties 75 or 100 years in age, then you've missed everything back to 1918. So that would leave a big gap in 20th century history. Today most things built in the 50s are starting to be considered to have significance in 20th century architecture because things changed so much after the war. But good observation. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
After the federal style, 1820, what was going on then?
Well, I'm going to get to that. In fact, we're going to go all the way from the federal style to about 1950. So I'm about to get rolling with that. Ned, if you could. So this is, I'm only showing this because someone would be bound to ask me, well, what did we have before 1720? Well, in Massachusetts, which we were, of course, once a part of, we have a sort of a generically assigned building style called First Period, which was considered really 1620 to about 1720. And we don't know of any of these in Maine. We believe that they're all gone. Although I bet if somebody looked hard enough down in York or in those parts, you might find a First Period building. The two buildings that you see here, this one is in Dedham. It's the Fairbanks House. Was built in 1637 to 41. Of course, it's been added onto over time. It still exists, open to the public, and that's the Paul Revere House in Boston, which was built in 1680. Next, please. I'm just showing you these for context. There aren't any here, don't worry, because Bridgton was not even cut out as a grant until 1763. But this is what they looked like. Very medieval. You can see the European roots, I think, in just the form of the building and the massive chimney. This is before we had lead flashing. Can you imagine? Before we had really glass of any size that you could create windows. Glass, very expensive. Go ahead. Here's the interior of a couple of those. Central heating, of course, was the central chimney. Some decorative paneling, pre-Georgian, really. I mean, this influence is directly from England. And then, open ceilings with the structure showing. Next, please. I've got about 50 of these. That's why I need to sort of pick up. So we'll end up here with one of the buildings from Strawberry Bank, and then some of the characteristics that would identify a First Period building that you can read. I won't repeat them. Next, please. Now, we do have buildings from the Georgian period. Certainly, many buildings left from pre-1750. Again, I've used this device to show you some of the features that illustrate what a Georgian building looks like. I'm showing you buildings tonight that on the one end of the spectrum are going to be very high style examples of that form or of the architectural style, and then other buildings that are more vernacular, such as this one. Now, Georgian buildings frequently had twin chimneys. They also had central chimneys. We're going to be going into each style in much more detail with probably 5 or 6 or more slides per style for the volunteers. So if anybody just can't get enough of this and they want to come to one of those meetings, you're welcome. Usually symmetrical in plan of the facade, central entry 5 bays wide, either a gabled roof or, next please. Whoops, that was a, sorry, that was a gambrel roof. Yeah, if you can go back one. That's a gambrel roof, pardon me. The other 3 are gable roofs. Okay, forward. Different versions of gambrel roofs this is in Portsmouth with dormers. This is the Tate House in Stroudwater down near Portland. And that has a very unusual gambrel roof. It's really recessed. A gambrel roof with recessed, they're really not dormers, they're windows in the roof plane that's been depressed. Here's an example with a hip roof, again with the twin chimneys. Next, please. Another central chimney, but with a salt box device added on the end, on the back side, usually having been the result of a shed having been added, and then the roof plane just continued. Another view of the Tate House showing you how large that chimney was. I think there was 6 or more flues in that building. Then finally, here's a later Georgian from the 1780s with 4 chimneys, which gave each, let's go to the next slide, it gave each of the front rooms, well, the 2 front rooms and the 2 rear rooms, each had a heating device, as you can see here. So that's a typical floor plan. And generally they were full 2-story buildings. Okay. These are much more high style examples of that same style, which was an English style named obviously after one of the Georges that was in power at that time in the, well, 2 of them were in power in the colonial period here. Again, the double chimneys, probably 4 chimneys on that one. So the hipped roof might sometimes have a deck and a balustrade, or it might be just a simple hipped roof like this with a ridge. Lots of detail on these buildings, yes. Next one. Now, at the close of the Revolution, we were anxious to leave all things Georgian behind us, because that was a painful period that we had just completed. But another style emerged from England, much simpler style and much lighter in the way it was expressed on the building in terms of the heft and weight of trim and windows and other features. So you have the federal style emerging about 1780, although that would be quite early for here. You might actually still see Georgian buildings being built here in 1790. So there's always an overlap between stylistic periods. This is the Harrison Gray Otis House on Cambridge Street in Boston, where Historic New England has its offices. 1793, I think. I think you recognize this place, and probably that one as well. Again, other examples of the federal application. These, by the way, both the Georgian and the federal style employed Roman classical features. Roman. You mentioned what happens after the federal period. We'll come to what happens then. Next.
All right.
A few more examples of more vernacular federal style houses. Here's a wood frame building, probably with the original clapboards. And then an example in brick, but with a slight elliptical arch over the door to give it a little more panache. Probably 4 chimneys originally, but only 2 now. And a again, another salt box version of that also. Often the front door frame is the main tip, whether it's federal or Georgian, but that gets kind of confusing, and I don't want to get into the weeds on that tonight. But this is actually more of a Georgian door frame, but the house itself is actually more federal. So now let me stop for a moment and say I haven't told you yet, but we're going to talk about two things tonight as we go through this part of the slideshow: style, and then building forms. And there are about 3 or 4 building forms that I'll show you. The first one being the ubiquitous Cape Cod dwelling, which is probably the everyman of our architectural collection of houses, certainly in New England, and particularly in northern New England. So we're going to consider the Cape as a form. But next, please. Oh, you know what I did? I got ahead of myself. Back up for a second if you could. Pardon me. So the federal style was expressed across a range of forms. One of them being the Cape. That's what I should have said. Which is not a style but a building form. Usually 1 story, 5 bays, sometimes 1.5 story. It lingered on well into the 19th century, and even today it's still a very popular house form. But the federal character was applied to all of these types of buildings. As you can see here, a church which has a very definite federal form in its bell tower. And then finally again here, the federal employed the very low-pitched hip roof, and then the doorway with the half circle, the Roman form again in the fanlight over the door. Okay.
Is there any significance to that fan light? I've been intrigued with them. I haven't been able to find it now.
Is there significance to it? It allowed more light into the front hall.
But not all of them were lights.
Yes, you often see them with louvers too. And I'm not sure I can explain to you what the owner's preference was in having louvers versus a fan light. Probably cost, because wood would have been a lot cheaper than glass, particularly cutting glass in narrow, triangular.
A lot of times the ceiling is lower, and so there isn't actually room to put the arch over top, so it's right in the
That's a
framing.
good point.
So
Yeah.
by showing the glass arch, it says, hey, I've got a tall hallway over here.
Which was intended to impress the neighbors and those who drove by in a cab. So you're exactly right. The front of the house was where they put their money. So, you'll also notice that, I'll back that up by saying foundations typically had the best dressed stones along the front and side walls of the house, not in the rear. So another example of what you just said. Go ahead, Nick. We can go forward. Okay, so this is a federal detail on the interior. It's a fireplace surround, and these moldings are very delicate, done with hand molding planes and very, very light, not very deep, not a lot of shadow. This one's a little heavier, and I could probably make an argument that this may have been from an earlier, or the transition period between Georgian and federal. But that's what I meant by a very light treatment of surfaces. Go ahead. Okay, so the Cape, which was really was a derivation of first period buildings, which by the middle of the 18th century had really resolved itself into the 1-story Cape as we know it today. The difference being, and again I have more slides for these when we get with the volunteers, you might have originally seen what's called a half Cape, which was only 3 bays, and then later on 1 bay or even 2 bays was added to make it a full Cape. Typically the additions were made in the early 19th century, up to 1840 or so. Capes too had gambrel roofs, and not sure what that one is going to tell me. Here's a cutaway showing the framing of a post and beam full Cape. Next, please. As I mentioned, the capes spanned several stylistic periods, and here they are right up until the Depression and even today. So there's probably no end to it. It's a very affordable and practical dwelling. So next, please. Now, to the gentleman in the rear. This is what happened about 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal. Ideas flowed from the East Coast westward, and so if you ever drive out through upstate New York, you'll think you're in Greek Revival style heaven. That's all that's out there, because the canal brought with it this influence. We also have a plethora of these buildings here in New England, and these are various examples. The main way you recognize a Greek Revival building is because two things. The building all right, I'm going to take a guess on this one, but I believe that the street is out here in front of the building. And this is a transitional Greek Revival, Federal Greek Revival. But by the 1830s, you see the building being turned from the long side facing the street to the gable end facing the street, and the appearance of a temple-like form being added to the end wall of the building. It's a startling change, and you'll be right 95% of the time if you see something that looks like that. It's Greek Revival. Sometimes they're disguised. This one with a porch. This front door treatment I think was added later on, so that's probably to be discounted at least for its original period. And then the windows as well. Typically Greek Revival windows were 6/6 double hung sash. Next one. Some more examples. I'm going to discount that for a moment because I'm not sure why I put that in with the Greek Revival. Oh, I know why. So here's a classic example. You see something like this in Portland on Spring Street. A little more vernacular here with a side hall plan where the door is not in the middle but on the side, and the stairway went up on the side of the building, yet it still has the full pediment of the Greek Revival temple. This one is an 1835 or so 3/4 cape. Now I'm really stretching your minds a little bit. So they've added one bay on, but they haven't added two full bays on. There was a porch on this end. And as you'll notice, there's now a great deal of distance between the door head and the roof eave. In the 1830s, these began to emerge and were called high-posted capes. And I've included it here because the front door is trimmed out in what looks like a Greek Revival temple with pilasters and a full cornice or a full entablature. So again, if you're interested in this sort of thing, those are the nuances we'll get into later on. Thanks. Now, the Greek Revival lasted, at least in Maine, it went well up to 1850, really beyond its time further south. But it was very popular. During the 1840s, however, particularly down in the Hudson River Valley, and spurred by a group of artists who we'll discuss in a moment, you begin to see something emerging called the Gothic Revival. Again, another style imported from Europe. And this is Lyndhurst in New York State, in the Hudson River Valley. Obviously, it's a high-style example. You won't find that, I don't think, here in Bridgton. Well, again, shifting gears for a moment, I do want to take this moment to introduce what's called another form, which is called the connected form of architecture. There's even a book about this called Big House, Back House, Little House, Barn. An excellent reading by a Maine author, actually.
Bridgton author.
What's that?
Bridgton author.
Yeah. And I think you can see here that the idea was that the house was eventually connected to the barn. Some say for efficiency in the wintertime of tending to the animals and doing chores. Others because it just was a more efficient plan of condensing everything. So you see a lot of these, particularly in Maine also. Next, please. So that's another form, and it may have different styles associated with it. The Gothic revival, I think, had its peak in the late 1840s, early 1850s. You've got some very nice examples of Gothic revival. I'll show you a couple more pictures in a minute. Here in town, particularly up by the monument at the circle, going down toward Freiburg, there's a couple. We have in Maine the beginning of the Gothic revival with the First Parish Church in Brunswick, which was the first example used here in this state, and after that it's all history, as they say. So go ahead, Ned. The Hudson River School of Landscape Painting largely influenced this, along with a couple of architects and prolific writers named Alexander Jackson Davis and Andrew Jackson Downing. They both promoted the Gothic revival as the most natural of styles. It changed everything, and no longer did we have white buildings. We begin to have buildings in pastel colors and earth tones. Picking up on what you see here. Next, please. Now, in most of our towns, we have what's called carpenter Gothic, which is really just a vernacular version of some of the higher style buildings I showed you a moment ago. Here's something similar to what you see in Bridgton. I know you've got several of those here in town. They're identified really by very steeply pitched roofs, frequently have a front dormer with what's called barge boards or verge boards decorating the eaves. Gingerbread is not an architectural term, it's a baker's term, I think. So anyway, that's just more of a description of that. Go ahead. Yeah, it is. So here are some details that also illustrate that particular style. Another weathered example here. And then, of course, the pointed Gothic arch window. You'll often see those in the buildings that were a little bit more expensive. Go ahead. Some more variations. Typically a rectangular plan. They were often 3 bays rather than 5 bays, or they had double windows.
But you don't class that as Victorian architecture.
It's just at the cusp of the beginning of what we would call the Victorian era. Victorian architecture actually spans about 4 or 5 different styles because she lived so long, over 50 years. But this is the beginning of it. Yeah. Greek revival you would not call Victorian architecture, but you could legitimately include this. Next, please. And then finally, for those of you who've been down to Kennebunk and have seen the wedding cake, this was a federal style house before it was converted in 1852. And all of the trim added, which is a maintenance nightmare, but nonetheless, we enjoy it. And there's one in stone. Some other things there I won't go into about the details on the porch and the arches.
Stone of Maine or mass?
What's that?
Stone of Maine or mass?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I meant that it's made of stone.
Oh, made of stone.
Constructed of stone, yeah. Go ahead. No, I wouldn't show a Massachusetts building here tonight. Are you kidding me? Now, another style swept the nation for a period very popular for at least 30 years and extended way out to 1885. So it spanned the Civil War, and this is kind of interesting because you see the Ruggles Mansion, Victorian Mansion in Cortland. Probably the prime example. It's actually considered the best example of the Tuscan revival style in the nation. We have it here in Portland. So I took liberties and showed 3 or 4 photos of it. But unbalanced symmetry in the way it was designed, tower, broadly overhanging, low-pitched roofs, heavy brackets, windows heavily articulated, often in stone, but usually in wood. Okay, Ned. And so here are some other examples as we step down the cost of building in brownstone. Much of the time you're going to see Italianate buildings that look like this or like this, either in wood or brick. And the first of the 3-decker apartment buildings actually used this style and did for many, many years, really up until the turn of the 20th century. So I think you'll recognize those when you see them because of the roof treatment. Usually the windows have a low-pitched segmental arch also. And at that point, we had moved to using 2/2 windows because glass technology had improved. We no longer had to use 8/8s or 6/6s. So, next.
Where's the brick house from? What is that?
This one?
No, you passed,
Go back.
yeah.
This one? That's Greater Portland Landmarks at the
Hay
corner.
and Peabody?
What's that?
Oh, that's not the Hay and Peabody building.
It's not. You're close though. It's about 3 blocks
I
away.
recognize where it is now.
But this is at the corner of Spring and High Streets.
Right.
And the date on that was 1858. The architect was Charles Alexander. And it's now Greater Portland Landmarks home. It was actually the Maine College of Art's first facility. Alexander, interesting. He, when the Civil War came, business tailed off a bit. So he stayed in Portland until 1870, and then got word of the Great Chicago Fire and quickly got on a train and went to Chicago and helped rebuild Chicago. He finally ended his career, and I think his last commission was the Jekyll Island Club in Georgia in the 1880s, which is still standing today. So he had a very interesting career. But the thing to understand about architecture in the 19th century, most architects were not formally trained until the second half of the century. So you had architect builders that used pattern books and studied imported designs from elsewhere and recreated all these things in wood because they were so skilled as journeymen. So, next. Now, competing with the Italianate style was the French Second Empire, or what we more popularly here today is the Mansard style, named after a gentleman named Pierre Mansart in France, who devised a way to get more space out of the top floor by pitching the roof almost vertically and putting a very low-pitched hip roof above that.
I thought it was to avoid taxes.
Well, that's another part of the story. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's the story goes that if you could add what looked like another floor, but not be taxed for it, that you were outwitting the tax collector. So this was just considered to be another story, not a roof. So here's what one looks like close up with slate shingles. Again, you're seeing a mixture here of Roman details that were imported with the style, even though it was a French style. So things become much more eclectic toward the latter part of the 19th century. That's a hotel, I think, that we're looking at on the right. That may be in Maine. I've forgotten where that is. Yeah. Thanks. So the key element, obviously, of the mansard style is the roof, and it was decorated in all sorts of ways. This is all cast iron cresting around the top. You had copper roofs with finials, massive dormers, typically 2/2 windows, and then Winslow Homer's house down here. It's not a very good view of the mansard roof, but that's actually a mansard roof cottage right on the ocean in Cape E. Yes, next. So, at this point, it can be said that architecture, in terms of its facade composition, started to become more asymmetrical, unbalanced, meaning, as you can see here, with a tower on one side and shifting the center of the building off the center of what the eye wants to look at. So we're going to see more of this, but this is the beginning of it. Okay, now. The stick style. Almost 100% of these buildings were executed in wood. And the idea of this was, again, another import from England to expose seemingly expose the actual structure of the building that's beneath the clapboards or the shingles. So they were decorated like this, but you're not actually looking at the structure, you're just looking at all decorative trim. But it was effective in creating a medieval atmosphere about the building, and they're quite distinctive because of the grid-like pattern that you see on the exterior. They were often clad in shingles, sometimes clapboards. Yeah.
that would be called a Tudor style?
He's gonna say
Tudor
sewer.
Gothic. There is a similarity, yeah. This is a little earlier than the Tudor Revival, which really came here in about 1915 or 20, but you're right about the similarity. The Romanesque style, once again, another import from Central Europe, Central Southern Europe, popularized here by a gentleman named Richardson, who was a Boston architect, and he did most of his work in public buildings, but not all of them, and did some very high-end townhouses in Chicago and in New York and Boston. And when I get to the next one, Ed will show. The former Portland Public Library, now called the Baxter Building in Maine, is a Romanesque revival, a building on Congress Street. I know you've seen libraries, train stations, and there are a few of each here that were done in this style. Trinity Church here in Boston. This is a railroad station out in the Midwest, I've forgotten where. But it was often done in brick and sandstone or with brownstone trim. Not so popular in wood. Again, it was during a period between recessions. It was between the 1873 recession and the 1896 recession. So we had an unprecedented 20-year growth period. There was a great documentary on the other night on public television called The Gilded Age, 2 hours. If you get to see it, one of the best I've seen about the period 1873 to when McKinley came in office in 96. So these buildings were squarely set within that period when there was the money to build them. And now, shingle style. I made a comment earlier that until this point we had imported virtually every architectural style to this side of the Atlantic for over 150, almost 200 years, until this. And John Calvin Stevens, a Portland architect, some of you I'm sure have heard his name, went forward with a style that ultimately became known as the shingle style. And so we now had buildings that were unbalanced, they're asymmetrical in form, clad with shingles not only on the roof, but the sidewalls, and then decorated with some other fanciful elements brought in from other styles, like the corner tower, these wall gables, and then the use of both stone and shingle here to give a very rusticated look next to it. And the first one he built is at 62 Bowdoin Street in Portland, still there. And he lived 2 doors down the street and ended up building all the buildings on that side of the street in this same style, not that same appearance, but the same style. And then probably the most famous shingle style house, which no longer exists, unfortunately, was the Low House down in Rhode Island, built by Charles McKim in 1887, a little later in the period. But this became probably the most popular style on the Maine coast and the Massachusetts coast for 20 years. And you'll see in a moment how it foreshadowed the Queen Anne period, which is coming next, by the way it was designed and the off-balanced gables and porches and corner porches and chimneys coming out of the most inopportune places in a valley, things like that. So next, please. So Queen Anne was a competing style, probably just about as popular as the shingle style. You don't see so much of these along the coast, but and certainly in the more populated areas and in industrial cities, you see these frequently. They literally had everything thrown at them. Here you have something with a sun porch with it's like a glazed roof. You've got a octagonal tower with a porch at the top of it, very steep gables borrowed from the Gothic earlier. Patterned slate roof, a porch that's octagonal as well, that almost has a rusticated Adirondack style balustrade. And then finally, the polychrome treatment of the paint scheme. You'll never find an original Queen Anne house without at least 3 colors of paint, which were designed that way to bring out features. So, next please. There's always the vernacular version. I picked one here that hadn't been painted in a while, just to show you, so it didn't jump off the screen at you. And then this one, it would be hard for anybody without a really highly trained eye to figure this out, but that actually is a Queen Anne period building. And it only is so because of some features on the porch that I found that you can't see the details here. And then this one, it has a projecting bay window, which goes all the way back to the Italianate period, and then you've got a very fancifully treated gable end of the building, and then it's brick. It's also asymmetrical, and it has a porch, so we're going to call it Queen Anne. Next. Another house form, off of styles for a moment, because these actually span both the Greek Revival and the Italianate, and even the Gothic Revival period. But Orson Squire Fowler came up with the ingenious idea that an octagon plan would be more efficient than a rectangular or a square plan. And some could argue that he was right. There were, I've forgotten the census, it was in the hundreds that were built, and probably the best one we have in Maine is in Farmington. If you're up there, it's right on a corner near the college. And in fact, let's see, which one is it? It's this one. Yeah, that's the one in Farmington.
There's one in Leamington.
Leamington?
Yeah, it's a private home.
Really?
Yep.
I didn't know that. Oh, great. Keep that in mind. Next, please. Now, at the end of the 19th century, and driven by something called the Centennial Exposition held in Chicago in 1893, I believe, McKim, Mead, and White, among others, famous New York architects, popularized a return to our colonial roots. So they suddenly emerged with a host of building designs which combined Georgian and federal, Greek and Roman forms, and came up with what for the next 30 years would be a very popular residential style throughout the nation. So here's a good example. This has a very ornate broken swan's neck pediment over the front door that usually you see only at historic Deerfield, but here it is, I think that's important. And then paralleling that, I'm going to jump from style to form here, the American Foursquare. Yeah, I'll show you a better picture in a moment of the Foursquare, but we'll stick with the revival for a moment. Well, 1940. Okay, that's fair. That's fair. I was told when I was in school studying architectural history that the way to tell a colonial revival building is that it's too perfect. If it looks colonial and it's too perfect, it's late 19th century or early 20th century. And you can see what I mean here, because this had to have been put together on a drafting table. It was not something that was built in a field. And so, next.
Kind of added interest to that is that furniture design followed the same pattern.
It did, didn't it? And,
Yes, it did.
and with the French Second Empire, we have a whole line of furniture that spanned the Greek
They
Revival up
took
to
them all and put
1850.
it together into various patterns.
Yeah. Yeah. The federal period had the, I'm trying to think of it, not the Hepplewhite, but there was, yeah, but each period had
Well, you could
something
see
that followed.
Hepplewhite designs on a piece of Victorian furniture with some Sheraton designs and everything.
Sure, that's the one I was thinking of, yeah. I've already said that, so I won't say more about it, but, this is just so overdone. If this had been early 19th century, you wouldn't have seen all this depth and heaviness of expression. Here's an example with a gambrel roof, and then finally, this has again got everything on it. It's got a semicircular front porch. It's got dormers spanned by a balustrade with a top deck on the hip roof. You've got the end chimneys, 6/1 windows. So, next. And then finally, as we back down the economic scale to something more affordable for all of us, these are Dutch colonial versions where the gambrel was used, but combined with a dormer, which gave more space on the second floor for a family. Sometimes clad in shingles, sometimes a little extra detail was thrown in. And often an end porch was added too. That's probably a detail you see generally associated mostly with the colonial revival. Next. Now, Flemish revival, that's a minor style, but you can see the decoration on the gable. The parapet was borrowed from the Netherlands. And okay, next. Now, the American Foursquare. I was trying to come back to this. This was again you could almost, it's a form, and it took on the appearance of colonial revival all the way up to really the Second World War with other variants on it. There have been arts and crafts style foursquares, but it was basically a square building. The plan was square, and lots of things were added to it. They most frequently had a hipped roof rather than a gabled roof, and when it was possible, you'd see a dormer, the front porch, often a side porch. Next. Threw in a floor plan so you'd see what that looked like. And heavier dormer treatment here. Pretty simple building which you could add detail to make it a little more impressive if you wish. Next. This one's particularly embellished. I'm trying to find one that's more simple here. This is pretty simple with a front porch and just a single dormer. Here they really went to some trouble and built it in brick, added, this is where the colonial revival comes in. These are actually federal period window heads with displayed trim. Next. Now we get into a couple of examples of bungalow style. This was done with a very interesting shingle pattern that was typical of the bungalow style. Heavy projecting overhang as the bungalows will want to have. Another one here that was done in stucco. Also arts and crafts, or and this one. I've got to go back and look at why I put that one in there. Pardon me. Okay, next. Because we were transitioning into the bungalow style. Okay. I won't ask you to read all this, but suffice to say that the bungalow originated in India. When Britain colonized India, they needed quarters for their troops. And so because of the glaring sun and the midday heat, they added a very deep overhang of the roof so that the sun would provide shade and keep the interior cooler. That was exported to England in the 1880s and then eventually made it to these shores after 1900. Next, please. And popularized by a fellow named Gustav Stickley. I'm sure you've heard of his furniture. There's the furniture link again. Here's his home in New Jersey, in Boonton, New Jersey, which is now a museum if you're interested in bungalow style. Bungalows were intended to be very naturalistic. They tried to employ stone and shingle and ribbon clapboards whenever possible, or sawn clapboards that were made to look rough. Often had a long roof pitch with a shed dormer. Next. Thank you. And probably this form is close to what you might see here in Bridgton. These were also manufactured by Montgomery Ward and Sears and shipped on railroad cars. And there's at least one Sears building in this town that I know of, Nell Ely's house.
Yeah.
Here's a little more of a close-up of what the details look like of the shed dormer, the deep overhang. You've got a projecting bay here. Almost always had a front porch. Much use of brackets. That was very popular during the bungalow period. Craftsman's style. The bungalow was really a form. The craftsman was the arts and crafts was really the style. Next. And then we jump to post-war. 1949, Philip Johnson's glass house in New Canaan, which is now a museum because it really couldn't effectively ever be used as a house. We found out. I'm glad he's not here to hear me say that. Anyway, a little impractical when you're trying to get dressed to go out in the morning. And then a different version of modernism or international style in California. At the bottom, that's actually a model. Next. Now, following the close of the Second World War, we had to create a lot of housing very quickly. And so this was part of the answer. The ranch, or down south as they call it, the Rambler, very popular for about a 35-year period, which morphed into something called the split level. Next. And I've included a lot of the characteristics, but I think you'll get the idea if you focus on the images. So these could be created in lots of ways. You notice that the field stone used here, or the ashlar stone used on the end of the building. Yeah, here you've got either clapboards or shingles. Very low pitched roofs. Very comfortable, very easy to get around, inexpensive to heat, low maintenance. Next. And then here are some vernacular versions. A couple of these are from South Portland, as I remember. Again, using a hip roof here on this building. But I think these are probably relatively recognizable to most people. This particular one was modular construction. Next. And then we'll finish up on the split level. Again, next. So I'm going to end on this question. I hope what I've said tonight is giving you some understanding of why we do this, why we perform architectural surveys, and what our end goal is. We're, in the end, trying to preserve the quality of our community and the characteristics and character of rural towns and villages. Next. So it's important because this place matters, which was a program of the National Trust for Historic Preservation several years ago that was very popular nationwide and got a lot of people interested in preservation. And I know she's involved in this because next, she wants to go on reaching for wisdom. So, thank you very much. I'll take questions if you have any more questions. I've probably blocked most of you.
A great example of that post-war is Levittown, Pennsylvania. That's hundreds of houses built the same way
Yeah.
to house all of those soldiers that are now getting married.
That was really the first mass production on a huge scale
Yeah.
of housing, that in Long Island. And
I'm not familiar with the
the one on Long Island was converted all the potato fields to just what you saw in Pennsylvania as well. Yes, sir.
Yes, you spoke of Bridgton having 4 identifiable villages.
Yeah.
Wonder if you could name them.
Sure. The central village, or the village, and north, south, and west Bridgton. And I learned that only this week because I picked up a copy of the online, the Bridgton Comprehensive Plan from 2014. And there's a very good 2-page summary of the history of Bridgton in here with some key dates. Also talks about the industry with the 3 mills, the railroad, and how in the after 1860 you began to develop a resort economy as well, with hotels and summer places. And most interesting, they said that now, instead of having a multitude of houses on the lakes available for rent in the summertime, there are fewer houses for rent because more of them are being converted to permanent year-round homes. So there's another shift, a historical shift in a pattern of development of Bridgton that was interesting. Yes?
There are many buildings in Bridgton in the vernacular and industrial history. It's not in the presentation.
Yeah.
Are they handled in the same way as far as with all of the programs that are available for restoration?
If they're income producing, then the tax credits are available. You and I could not live in our own home and claim the tax credits because it's not income producing. But if it's an income producing building, whether it's commercial or residential rental, yes, the tax credits are available.
Along Stevens Brook down to the lake, there are lots of industrial buildings that are used for generating income. Are those the buildings that would be available for those programs?
As long as they can be determined eligible to be listed on the National Register. That's the other catch. The buildings that are eligible for the tax credits either have to be individually listed on the National Register or as part of a district that's a National Register district. I think we'll better know the answer to that after the survey is completed. I am not an expert by any means in Bridgton's architecture. As I say, I've seen it in dribs and drabs, but the area you're talking about sounds like, was this factory housing that was created to house workers that worked in the mills, or were these shops for machine shops?
Shops.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't surprise me if they are eligible. We'll see. It all depends on, this is another whole lecture, but there's this thing called integrity. So to be on the National Register, a building has to retain some reasonable amount of its original integrity. It can't be so altered that it's not recognizable for what it was originally. But if these buildings still have recognizable integrity for what they were, and we can create a story about what occurred there and how it all developed, there's a reasonable chance that you could create a National Register district. And again, National Register district, if anybody lives in a National Register property now or is contemplating that, the myth that I have to dispel at every public meeting I attend is that, no, we don't want anything to do with National Register of Historic Places because it infringes on our property rights. Let me tell you, it does not. And I'll send you 3 or 4 documents with other things that it does and does not do if you'd like to see that. But I run into this all the time because there's a lot of resistance when people think that their private property rights in their home is going to be breached if they're in a National Register Historic District. There's no effect. You could tear the building down if you wanted to and nobody would blink. If there's a local historic district, that's another matter, where you have a local ordinance that protects a district in a town by virtue of controlling how the building permit is issued. If it's a historic building and it's in a local historic district, there's usually a commission, and the commission will review the application and then either say yay or nay, or more often work with the owner to bring the application into conformance with the standards of that district, and then you get your building permit. So I just want to make that distinction. So I know there's a lot of concern about that. So, yes?
For those of you who don't know me, I'm Margaret Reimer. I'm the president of the trustees here at Bridgton Historical, and I live in a National Historic Registry house. So if anybody's got questions, would you like to find out a little bit, I absolutely second what you say. You know, we could put up a chicken house, we could do all the things that we needed to do on our property. It's not a problem, and I'd be happy to answer questions if you have some.
And likewise, I'm available by either email or you can call our office in Yarmouth. Just go to the internet, look up Maine Preservation, and you'll find my name and my telephone number and my email under the field service program. So, yes, sir.
Looking at all the different styles, I noticed that there's a period of maybe spanning 60 years where there was a half a dozen or more styles introduced, and I'm just curious as to what drove that market, or because it had to be fed. I mean, people had to be interested. Was it more of what the Hudson River Valley School created, that desire for change in architecture and style and landscaping, or?
No, I think I would attribute it more to the rise of international trade. After the War of 1812, we had a pretty good relationship with everybody on the other side of the pond thereafter. So trade was restored and ideas were exchanged. You have to remember, this was a period of immigrants flowing to the United States in huge volumes, and with them came some trained people in architecture that brought ideas here. So I think that's it, really. And of course, there was a competition with Europe also. You know, not to be outdone by European styles. As soon as something was introduced here, we wanted to build a bigger one and a better one. I mean, that's all part of the whole manifest destiny thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly, sure.
Paradigm.
We were now becoming a net exporter of manufactured goods, so that helped. So.
What's the timing and when do you expect results?
I have to speak to Ned about that. He's in charge of the project.
Yeah. The one thing I left out of, the important thing I left out of the introduction was, Chris referred to it, and I think most of you know, we're looking for volunteers to do this survey. And if you want to help us out, look into it, just talk to me, contact me.
And what's
We'll
the
be
time
setting
frame?
up-
Yeah, for that.
We'll be setting up, we were talking about 3 training sessions, I think,
Something like
with
that.
you. Sometime in the
Spring.
next, late, early spring, end of winter, and getting the survey going after that.
So we want the survey done during the summer.
Yeah, the
it's
field work.
It's actually
Early
ideal
summer.
to take the photographs in April and May. So I'd like to try to get the training done and get people deployed, at least a photography group, so that in May, before we gain all the foliage on the trees, we can get most of the photography done. And I will say that since this is a first go at this, and we're going to be working mostly with volunteers that haven't done this before, this may lapse into next year even. So I don't have an expectation about how it goes, except that we want to train people, get them out there. And
You don't have to be
Yes,
a
the
Bridgton resident to do
No,
this.
no,
Okay,
no.
good.
And we are.
Nobody from Casco.
I'm from Mass.
And this, just to sort of be clear, this is actually being funded by the town. It's a capital expense that they have put towards this. We will be starting with North and South High Street, Main Street, Portland Road, and also looking at North and South Bridgeton. Those are our first priorities. But we will want to do the whole town as time and
part
resources.
of wanting to do the
possible.
commercial area first is so that we can make a determination what additional buildings can go on the National Register. I neglected to say, I think Bridgeton has only 13 buildings listed on the National Register, and I don't think you have a district.
No, we don't have to.
Yeah. So 13 buildings isn't a lot compared to what you have, and if we did the commercial areas first, that'll give those owners and merchants an opportunity to take advantage of the tax credits if they want to do some reinvestment. So, and we can help with that too. We help with the tax credits. So.
Ned, do you have a sign-up sheet?
No, not as such.
Okay.
Just
Probably
come
can get
to me and
And write stuff down.
Yeah.
You're gonna keep a copy of all the pictures of the house?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
I didn't know
There'll be
where they were
digital
going.
copies, and they're very high standards for both the digital and the paper copy and rest of the Maine Preservation Commission keeps a archived copy of it all, at least they did as far as I know, right?
Yeah.
And we will too. I mean,
Have they done a survey of local towns? I know you said, was it Yarmouth somewhere?
Yeah.
I know, I worked in Freeport, they did one in Freeport in the 70s, and he's good.
You know,
Updated it somewhat.
I don't actually know how many towns in the state have done a survey. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission might know. I'm going to say it's probably not more than 10 or 15% though. It's not a really popular thing to do, despite all the fun I tried to put into it tonight. I mean, it's work, and it takes volunteers, and it takes a lot of organization, and it's got to have some level of professional performance. So, and I also think that it follows with planning. I mean, when you realize that something like 60% of the towns in Maine don't have any zoning or really any formal planning department of any kind, that's another reason, I think, because there hasn't been a call for it. But
And it helps us to, people talk about, valuing the historic character of the community and so on, but we don't often define it in any very specific way. So this helps give us real benchmarks to judge.
From this could grow more things in the future.
It's also a terrific resource when somebody wants to know about their house.
Yeah.
Well, not
Just
only
great.
that, I restored one of the oldest houses in Hollowell a number of years ago, and in order to find out what the pediments and things looked like, they had already done a pictorial,
Row house.
yeah,
They
of,
did that,
of
yeah.
that town, and I was able to follow other houses that were similar and come up with what
Yeah.
I felt from different outlines that I was able to ascertain on the houses what different things look like. So it's fantastic for somebody
Yeah.
who's involved in restoration.
Yeah. That's a great testimonial. Just a sec. You had a question.
Well, I was wondering, I'm thinking of this really, really beautiful craftsman style lake house. It's down in Naples, but it faces the lake. And so we have a lot of property on the lakes, and I'm wondering, will we actually go out on the water and take a picture of the building
Well, call me when you do.
from the main direction?
Don't bring the beer.
That's fair game, in my opinion. I mean, to be able to see the facade, because with so many trees, it may be difficult to see the building at all from the roadway.
Right.
So, yeah,
And usually they face the lake, they don't face
Right.
the...
Right. No, that's a good point. So Ned, get the Marines involved in this.
Okay, yeah.
We'll get some.
We'll find some room in the budget for a boat.
Yeah. Yes.
Maybe this is naive, but we're basically talking about like just going out and taking pictures. But what about the aspect of deed research and the history of each building? And, where does that come into this process?
That is usually toward the end of the program.
Okay.
And I often recommend that is something that you could do between November and April. Because it's a great research project when the weather isn't so great. So, yeah, I mean, we would need people to do that
That'll be
also.
volunteer based too.
Yep. Yeah. And anybody that has never done title research, it's a fascinating endeavor to get into that. And it's so much easier today with the computer. They've got records now back, to 1900 or before on the computer. So the old days, we used to open the ledgers and, Yes.
Just note for regarding the tax information on houses. We've got the almost complete 1930 tax records for the town of Bridgton. So most of the old houses we're looking at would be included in that.
Yeah.
And we're in the we have the full archival history of them here, and we can look through them by number. Although they did renumber the streets a while ago, so it takes a little while to find out the system they're using. And we're in the process of digitizing those onto the main memory network.
Terrific.
So
Terrific.
they
Yeah,
will
if
become
anybody
searchable
wants to help with
resources.
that.
If anyone wants to help digitize those,
Because that is a very long process.
Yeah.
It's taking a lot longer than I thought it would.
You're fortunate. Most towns don't have the older tax records. Portland has the 1924 tax records with a photo of each house.
These are
But
like-
you're one of the few
Yeah.
towns that has something similar to that,
Yeah.
so that's great.
Yeah.
That'll be a big
it's
help.
Terrific.
And that'll help people that
Exactly.
want to look at what their house appeared like almost 100 years ago, 90 years ago. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That was really enjoyable.